Hello there, and welcome to Just About Earth, a place where curiosity slows down a little, where science is allowed to wander at an unhurried pace, and where big questions are explored gently enough that you don't have to hold them too tightly. Tonight, we're going to spend some time with an idea that is both enormous and strangely intimate, a vision of Earth not as we know it today, divided by oceans and borders, but as it once was, whole, connected, and continuous. A world where every piece of land belonged to the same uninterrupted surface. A world that, for a very long time, existed as one. The idea begins with a simple question that sounds almost playful at first, but grows heavier the longer you sit with it. What if the Earth was never meant to be divided in the way we know it now? What if the separation of continents was not the natural order of things, but a long, slow unravelling of something that once functioned as a single system? What if Pangaea, the ancient supercontinent, wasn't just a temporary arrangement of land, but the original world order itself? It's easy to picture the modern Earth as the default version. Familiar outlines of continents, oceans filling the spaces between them, maps that feel so permanent we forget they're only snapshots. But the planet has never been still. Long before humans named oceans or traced borders, the ground beneath everything we know was already moving, already preparing for change. And before that movement pulled the continents apart, there was a time when the land did not need bridges or ships to connect it. It was already connected. As you listen, you might notice yourself imagining that world without trying. A single landmass stretching so far that weather patterns behaved differently, animals moved without encountering coastlines, and silence itself might have felt larger in places far from the sea. There's something oddly calming about picturing Earth before it learned how to break itself into pieces. Before we go any further, let me ask you something simple. Where are you listening from right now? Not just geographically, but in your day. Are you winding down after hours that felt too full, or easing into rest earlier than usual? And what time is it where you are? It's fitting to ask because this story exists outside our usual sense of time. The world we're exploring tonight doesn't run on clocks or calendars. It moves in spans so large they barely register as motion at all. If you find this space soothing, or if slow science helps your thoughts loosen their grip a bit, you're always welcome to like the video or subscribe. It helps this quiet corner reach others who might also need something steady and unhurried to listen to. No rush, though. Nothing here requires urgency. Now, let's begin gently. When scientists talk about Pangaea, they often describe it as a phase, one configuration among many in Earth's long history, but that framing can be misleading. Pangaea existed for hundreds of millions of years, long enough for entire ecosystems to rise, spread, adapt, and disappear without ever knowing another arrangement of the planet. For life living during that time, this wasn't a temporary state, it was the world. The name Pangaea comes from Greek roots meaning all Earth, and that description is more literal than poetic. Nearly all of the planet's land was gathered into one vast mass, surrounded by a single global ocean. There were no Atlantic or Pacific oceans as we know them. Coastlines were fewer and farther apart. Inland regions stretched for thousands of kilometres without ever meeting the sea. If you had stood somewhere near the centre of Pangaea, you could have travelled for weeks, even months, without encountering an ocean breeze. Rainfall patterns were different. Temperatures behaved differently. The land didn't benefit from the moderating influence of nearby water. Summers could be brutally hot. Winters could be severe. Climate was less forgiving, but also more consistent in its extremes. This matters because climate shapes everything else. It decides which plants can survive, which animals can move freely, and where life settles or struggles. On a unified continent, those rules applied across enormous distances without interruption. Migration wasn't blocked by oceans. Evolution didn't branch in isolation as easily. Life was shared across land that felt endless. It's tempting to imagine that a single continent would create a single kind of world, but that wasn't the case. Pangaea still had mountains, deserts, forests and floodplains. It still had variation. What it lacked was separation. There were no natural walls formed by deep water, no long-term isolation between populations on opposite sides of the planet. This raises an interesting possibility. A world without oceans dividing land would have produced a different rhythm of life. Species that, in our timeline, evolved independently on separate continents might never have split apart at all. Predators and prey would have encountered each other sooner. Plants would have spread farther before specializing. Extinction events would have played out across a unified stage rather than fragmented ones. Even the sky might have felt different. With fewer coastlines, storm systems behaved in larger, slower patterns. Winds travelled farther before being disrupted. Seasonal cycles were broad and powerful. The Earth's rotation was the same, but the way heat moved across the surface followed different rules. And beneath all of this, far below anything living could sense, the planet was already preparing to change. The surface of Earth rests on massive plates of rock that float slowly atop the mantle. These plates don't glide smoothly. They grind, push, stretch, and buckle over timescales so long they're almost invisible. Pangaea existed because those plates had once moved together. It ended because they began to move apart. But here's where the question becomes more than geological. If Pangaea had been stable for so long, if life had adapted to its unified conditions, if the planet itself seemed to function as a single interconnected system, then what does it mean that it broke apart? Was fragmentation inevitable? Or was it simply the next phase of an Earth that never truly settles? And if the land had remained connected, if the rifting never began, if the oceans we know had never opened, would the world today feel more ordered or less? Would life have flourished more evenly, or would a single dominant system have limited diversity? Would humans, if they emerged at all, have experienced a world without distant continents, without unknown lands across water, without the psychological weight of separation? These are not questions with simple answers, and they don't need to be solved quickly. They're meant to unfold slowly, just like the movements they describe. For now, it's enough to hold the image of a planet that once breathed as a single surface, one where land did not end abruptly at water, and where movement across the world did not require ships or courage, only time. Long before the continents learned how to separate, before oceans widened and coastlines multiplied, the Earth existed in a state that feels almost unfamiliar to us now. Not because it was chaotic or violent, but because it was steady in a way we rarely associate with planets. This was a time when the surface of the world did not behave like a restless puzzle slowly pulling itself apart. Instead, it held together, not rigidly, but with a kind of deep geological patience. It's difficult for the human mind to grasp stillness on planetary timescales. We're used to thinking in years, maybe decades if we're stretching our imagination. Even centuries start to feel abstract. But the Earth operates on spans so large that motion can happen without ever being noticed by the life living on top of it. Before the drift began, before the cracks formed and widened, the land remained joined for hundreds of millions of years, not frozen, not lifeless, just unbroken. To understand that period, it helps to let go of the modern image of tectonic plates as constantly shifting pieces. Yes, the plates were always there, and yes, they were always capable of movement. But motion requires imbalance. Pressure needs somewhere to go. Heat needs pathways. Before the Earth learned to drift in the way we recognize today, those conditions were different. The forces beneath the crust were distributed in a way that favored stability over separation. The mantle beneath the surface was hot, but its currents moved slowly and broadly. Instead of sharply defined upwellings and rifts, there were vast regions where heat circulated without tearing the crust apart. The lithosphere, the rigid outer shell of the planet, was thicker in many places than it is today. A thicker crust resists tearing. It bends before it breaks. That bending allowed stress to be absorbed and spread out rather than focused into fractures. This doesn't mean the Earth was quiet. Volcanoes still erupted, mountains still rose and wore down, earthquakes still happened. But these events were not yet part of a global pattern of division. They were adjustments, not separations. The planet was moving, but it was moving inwardly, redistributing energy rather than opening itself. From the perspective of life, this mattered enormously. Stability at the planetary scale creates predictability at the surface. When land stays connected, when oceans don't repeatedly open and close between populations, ecosystems develop differently. Species spread widely before specializing. Genetic exchange continues across vast distances. Extinction in one region is less likely to erase an entire lineage because there are fewer isolated pockets where life is trapped. The Earth during this time wasn't static, but it was cohesive. Think of it less like a rigid slab and more like a slow-breathing body. Expansion and contraction happened, but within limits. The planet adjusted without breaking its own surface into isolated pieces. One of the most important things about this era is that nothing about it felt transitional to the organisms living then. There was no sense of a world on the verge of coming apart. For plants, animals and microorganisms, this arrangement simply was. Rivers flowed across enormous distances without meeting oceans. Deserts stretched inland for thousands of kilometres. Forests didn't stop at coastlines because coastlines were rare. Without frequent access to the sea, interior climates behaved differently. Water cycles were longer and harsher. Rainfall depended heavily on seasonal shifts rather than constant ocean-fed moisture. This created regions of extreme dryness and extreme heat far from any moderating influence. Yet life adapted. It always does. Plants evolved to conserve water. Animals adjusted their behaviours and bodies to survive long stretches without rain. What's important here is not the hardship, but the consistency. The rules didn't change rapidly. When conditions are stable for long periods, evolution takes a different path. Instead of reacting to frequent disruptions, life optimizes itself for the existing system. It becomes efficient, sometimes specialized, sometimes resilient, but always shaped by what stays the same rather than what keeps changing. Beneath all of this, the planet continued to cool very slowly. Heat from Earth's formation and radioactive decay was still escaping, but at a pace that allowed the crust to remain mostly intact. Cooling matters because it changes how the mantle behaves. As heat escapes, convection patterns evolve. Over time, the slow circulation that once supported cohesion begins to reorganize. This is where the idea of the Earth learning to drift becomes useful. Not in a literal sense, of course, but as a way of thinking about gradual capability rather than sudden action. The planet didn't flip a switch and start tearing itself apart. It accumulated the conditions necessary for drift, long before any visible separation occurred. As heat flow patterns changed, certain regions beneath the crust began to warm more intensely than others. Hotspots developed. These weren't dramatic at first. They didn't immediately create rifts or oceans. They simply thinned the crust from below. Thinning makes rock more flexible. Flexible crust bends more easily under stress. And bending, given enough time and pressure, becomes cracking. At the surface, none of this would have been obvious. There were no sudden lines splitting the land, no warning signs visible to any creature walking across the world. The Earth was preparing internally, quietly adjusting its internal mechanics, while life continued uninterrupted above. This long preparation phase is easy to overlook because it doesn't leave clean, dramatic markers in the geological record. We tend to focus on the moments when continents visibly split, when oceans form, when dramatic changes occur. But those moments are the result, not the beginning. The beginning is almost always subtle. In fact, the longest part of continental history is not separation, but togetherness. Supercontinents don't form and break constantly. They assemble, persist, and then slowly unravel. The assembly and persistence phases last far longer than the breakup itself. Pangaea was not an anomaly. It was part of a cycle that the Earth has repeated before and will likely repeat again. Before Pangaea, there were other supercontinents, earlier attempts at cohesion. Each one formed under slightly different conditions. Each one lasted for a time. Each one eventually gave way to fragmentation. This suggests something important about the Earth's nature. It doesn't prefer separation or unity permanently. It oscillates between the two. During periods of unity, like the one before drift became inevitable, the planet behaves as a single system. Heat flow, climate, ocean circulation, and biological evolution all operate on a global scale without barriers. During periods of fragmentation, those same processes become regional, localized, and more varied. Neither state is better or worse in an absolute sense. They produce different outcomes. Unity favours wide distribution and shared systems. Fragmentation favours diversity, isolation and specialisation. The Earth doesn't choose between them. It experiences both. But for a long stretch of time, before the first cracks hinted at separation, the Earth leaned heavily toward unity. And that shaped everything that followed. Even gravity behaves slightly differently when land is distributed unevenly. Large land masses affect how mass is distributed across the planet's surface. This influences sea level, atmospheric circulation, and even the planet's rotation in subtle ways. A single massive continent creates different stress patterns than multiple smaller ones. These stresses feed back into the mantle, influencing where heat rises and where it sinks, so cohesion reinforces itself until it doesn't. Eventually, small imbalances grow. A region where the crust is slightly thinner becomes more flexible. A mantle plume beneath it adds heat. Tension builds as surrounding areas resist movement. The crust stretches, not enough to tear, but enough to weaken. Over millions of years, that weakness deepens. From the outside, nothing dramatic happens. Life continues. Rivers carve valleys, mountains rise and erode, forests expand and retreat with the seasons. But below, the conditions that once favoured togetherness begin to favour release. It's worth pausing on this idea because it reframes how we think about change. The Earth didn't suddenly decide to become dynamic. It was always dynamic. What changed was how that dynamism expressed itself. Movement that once circulated internally began to express itself externally. This transition didn't feel like an ending. There was no moment when the Earth crossed a clear boundary from still to active. There was only a gradual shift in balance, a slow tipping of internal processes toward a new expression. In that sense, the Earth didn't stop being stable. It redefined what stability meant. As this internal preparation continued, the surface world remained unaware. If any creature could have observed the planet as a whole, which none could, they still wouldn't have seen continents drifting apart. That stage hadn't arrived yet. What existed instead was a world holding itself together while quietly building the capacity to let go. This is why imagining Pangaea as the original world order is so compelling. Not because it was eternal, but because it was complete. It functioned as a whole system for long enough that life, climate and geology all adapted to that completeness. Fragmentation came later, and when it did, it reshaped everything that followed. When people first hear about Pangaea, the image that often comes to mind is a neat puzzle. Modern continents slid together like cardboard cutouts until their edges line up. Africa nestled against South America, North America tucked into Europe, Antarctica hovering below like an afterthought. It's a helpful starting point, but it's also a simplification. The true shape of a supercontinent is not something that fits cleanly into our habits of map reading or our instinct for symmetry. Pangaea was not tidy. It was not balanced in the way we expect worlds to be. It was massive, uneven, and stretched in ways that challenge how we imagine land itself. To understand the shape of a supercontinent, it helps to stop thinking of continents as fixed silhouettes and start thinking of them as outcomes. The outlines we know today are the result of millions of years of erosion, rising seas, sediment buildup, and biological activity along coastlines. Pangaea's edges were shaped by entirely different conditions. Its coastlines were fewer, longer, and in many places harsher. Large portions of its perimeter faced a single global ocean, while vast interior regions had no coastlines at all. At its widest, Pangaea spanned nearly from one pole to the other. This north-south stretch mattered. It meant that climate zones ran across the same landmass rather than being separated by oceans. Tropical regions blended gradually into temperate zones, which then faded into colder southern reaches. There were no ocean barriers to interrupt this progression. Air masses moved freely across the land, carrying heat, cold, and dust over extraordinary distances. The interior of Pangaea was immense. If you imagine standing somewhere near its centre, you would be farther from the sea than almost anywhere on modern Earth. This had a profound effect on the shape of the land itself. Without nearby oceans to regulate temperature and moisture, the interior experienced strong seasonal extremes. Heat caused expansion, cold caused contraction. Over long periods, this stress influenced how rock fractured, how mountains formed, and how basins developed. Mountains on Pangaea were not distributed evenly. Some of the tallest and most extensive mountain ranges in Earth's history formed as the continents collided to create the supercontinent in the first place. When large land masses converge, the crust thickens. Rock is folded, thrust upward, and stacked. The result is not a single ridge, but broad, elevated regions that can stretch for thousands of kilometers. These mountain systems didn't form because Pangaea existed. They formed because Pangaea was coming into existence. The shape of the supercontinent carries the memory of those collisions. Today, traces of these ancient ranges can still be found scattered across multiple continents, broken apart and eroded, but once connected as part of a single structure. The surface of Pangaea was not flat between these highlands. Large basins formed where the crust sagged under its own weight. Rivers flowed outward from elevated regions, sometimes reaching the distant sea, sometimes evaporating or pooling in inland lakes that had no outlet. Over time, sediment filled these basins, creating broad plains that shifted subtly as the crust flexed. Because the land was continuous, drainage patterns were enormous. Some river systems would have been longer than any river we know today, not because water flowed faster, but because it had farther to go before reaching the ocean. Others never reached the ocean at all. They ended inland, feeding temporary seas that expanded and contracted with climate cycles. These inland seas played a quiet but important role in shaping the supercontinent. They moderated local climates, deposited minerals, and created habitats isolated not by water barriers, but by distance and aridity. Life within these regions adapted to conditions that changed slowly but decisively over time. The outline of Pangaea was also influenced by the balance of mass across the planet. When most of Earth's land is gathered into one area, it changes how weight is distributed. The crust beneath the supercontinent sat lower relative to sea level than it would if the same land were spread out. This effect, known as isostasy, meant that Pangaea's coastlines did not simply reflect the edges of land meeting water. They reflected a balance between crustal thickness, mantle buoyancy, and the immense weight of rock above. As a result, some coastal regions were steep and abrupt, while others sloped gently into shallow seas. Continental shelves, which today host rich marine ecosystems, were narrower in many places. This limited the extent of shallow coastal waters and changed how nutrients moved between land and sea. The surrounding ocean, often called Panthalassa, dominated the planet's surface. It was vast beyond anything we experience today. With only one major landmass interrupting it, ocean currents followed broad, uninterrupted paths. These currents influenced the shape of Pangaea's coastlines, eroding some areas aggressively while allowing sediment to accumulate in others. Storm systems behaved differently as well. With such long stretches of uninterrupted land, Weather patterns could build strength over thousands of kilometers. Wind carried fine particles across the interior, shaping deserts and depositing layers of dust that would later harden into rock. These deposits still exist, recorded in geological layers now scattered across continents that were once neighbours. The supercontinent's shape also affected the planet's rotation very slightly. Large-scale redistribution of mass can influence how Earth spins, not enough to notice day to day, but enough to matter over geological time. This subtle feedback between shape and motion adds another layer to the story. The planet and its surface were constantly responding to each other, adjusting in ways too slow to feel, but too powerful to ignore. One of the most striking aspects of Pangaea's shape is how asymmetrical it was. It did not sit neatly centered on the globe. Large portions extended into one hemisphere more than the other. This imbalance affected climate and ocean circulation. One hemisphere experienced broader seasonal contrasts, while the other was more strongly influenced by oceanic moderation. This unevenness also influenced where stress accumulated in the crust. Some regions bore more of the planet's internal pressure than others. Over time, these differences would matter. They would help determine where the first cracks appeared, where rifts would eventually form, and how the supercontinent would begin to change shape. But before that transformation, Pangaea existed as a coherent whole. Its shape was not an accident. It was the product of deep time processes working together, shaping land on a scale that defies easy visualization. For life, this shape defined opportunity and limitation. Animals could roam across continents without crossing water, but they also faced vast stretches of inhospitable terrain. Plants could spread widely, but only those capable of tolerating extreme conditions could survive in the interior. Ecosystems formed along gradients rather than boundaries. This continuity influenced evolution in subtle ways. Instead of being separated by oceans, populations were separated by distance, climate, and elevation. Genetic exchange was possible across enormous ranges, but not guaranteed. The result was a patchwork of life adapted to specific niches within a unified landmass. The supercontinent's shape also influenced how time was experienced by the planet itself. Geological processes that occur at boundaries today, like subduction along ocean margins, were concentrated in fewer regions. This meant that energy release, mountain building, and volcanic activity were more focused in certain areas, leaving others relatively quiet. Quiet does not mean inactive. Even regions far from plate boundaries were shaped by slow warping, erosion, and sedimentation. Over millions of years, these subtle processes transformed landscapes just as thoroughly as dramatic events. What's easy to forget is that Pangaea's shape was not fixed even during its existence. It flexed, adjusted, and subtly reshaped itself over time. The outline we reconstruct today represents an average, a snapshot drawn from many overlapping stages. Coastlines shifted, inland seas appeared and vanished. Mountain ranges rose and eroded. Despite this internal motion, the defining feature remained continuity. Land connected to land in every direction. There was no concept of separate continents, only regions within a whole. This makes the idea of an original world order feel less like speculation and more like recognition. For a long stretch of Earth's history, the default state of the surface was unity. Separation came later, slowly and unevenly, and it would change the shape of everything that followed. There was a time when the idea of a road ending at water simply didn't exist. Not because humans hadn't invented roads yet, but because the land itself did not present an ending in the way we understand it now. On a unified Earth, movement across the surface followed different rules. Distance mattered, climate mattered, terrain mattered, but water was not an unavoidable barrier cutting paths short. Land led to more land, and then more again, stretching on until the very idea of across the world meant something far less abstract than it does today. When all roads were land, Movement was defined by continuity. An animal could migrate without ever encountering an ocean. A plant species could spread gradually generation by generation without being confined to a peninsula or an island. Rivers did not mark the edge of a continent but flowed inward, outward, and sideways across an uninterrupted surface. Even the wind behaved as if it expected no sudden interruptions. To appreciate what this meant, it helps to think less about roads as we build them, and more about paths as life naturally creates them. Migration routes, animal trails, river valleys, seasonal movements. These were the true roads of Pangaea. They didn't need engineering. They emerged from repetition, memory, and necessity. When a path worked, it was used again. When it didn't, it faded. Over time, certain routes became deeply etched into the landscape. Without oceans dividing land masses, migration could occur on scales that are almost impossible today. Large animals could follow climate zones as they shifted over geological time. As temperatures cooled in one region and warmed in another, populations could move gradually rather than being trapped. There was no sudden need to adapt or perish because of isolation. The land itself provided options. This had consequences for evolution that are subtle but far-reaching. Isolation is one of the strongest drivers of diversification. When populations are cut off, they adapt independently, sometimes dramatically. On a world where land is continuous, isolation still happens, but it happens through distance, climate extremes, and geography rather than abrupt separation. Mountains, deserts, and inland seas created challenges, but they were porous barriers. Over long enough timescales, life could find ways around them. As a result, species distributions on a supercontinent tend to be broader. This doesn't mean everything lived everywhere. Conditions still varied. But it does mean that related species could occupy enormous ranges, slowly adapting along gradients rather than splitting suddenly into isolated lineages. Imagine a large herbivore moving across Pangaea. Its ancestors might have lived in a warm, semi-arid region. Over generations, descendants could spread northward into cooler climates or southward into wetter ones. Each group would adapt slightly, but gene flow could continue where ranges overlapped. The differences would be gradual, not abrupt. Predators followed similar patterns. Instead of being confined to a single continent, they could track prey across vast distances. This kept evolutionary pressure consistent. Adaptations that worked in one region often needed to work across many. Extreme specialization was riskier when competitors and threats could arrive from far away. Plants experienced the same continuity. Seeds carried by wind, water, or animals could travel farther before encountering an impassable boundary. Over time, this allowed plant lineages to spread widely, forming massive biomes that extended across the supercontinent. Forests didn't stop because the land ended. They stopped because climate shifted or soil changed. The absence of ocean barriers also influenced how diseases and parasites spread. Pathogens could move gradually with their hosts rather than being confined to isolated regions. This created a different balance between resistance and vulnerability. Widespread species needed broader defences. Local adaptations still occurred, but they were tested against a larger, more connected ecological network. When all roads were land, time itself felt different in an evolutionary sense. Change happened, but it unfolded across space rather than snapping into new forms through isolation. The world encouraged continuity over fragmentation. Even geological processes reinforced this idea. Rivers carved paths that linked distant regions. Sediment travelled far before settling. Nutrients moved across land rather than being quickly flushed into oceans. This recycling supported inland ecosystems that today would struggle without coastal input. The interior of Pangaea, despite its harsh climate in places, was not lifeless. It was shaped by these long-distance connections. Seasonal rivers appeared and disappeared, creating temporary corridors of life. Animals timed their movements to follow these cycles. Plants evolved strategies to survive long dry periods and take advantage of brief wet ones. In such a world, navigation was not about crossing water, but about understanding patterns. Animals learned when to move, where to go, and how far they could travel before resources thinned. These behaviours were encoded slowly, shaped by generations of success and failure. If intelligent beings had existed then, their sense of geography would have been profoundly different. There would have been no concept of distant continents across unreachable seas. The world would have felt large, but continuous. Exploration would mean endurance rather than daring. The unknown would be over the horizon, not beyond an ocean. This continuity also affected how disturbances played out. A drought in one region did not trap life permanently. Populations could shift. After volcanic eruptions or climate shifts, recovery could draw from a wider pool of organisms. Extinction events still occurred, but their dynamics were shaped by connection rather than isolation. Contrast this with today's world, where continents act like biological islands. Australia's unique fauna, South America's long isolation, Madagascar's endemic species. These exist because water became a barrier. On Pangaea, such isolation was rare and temporary. Endemism still existed, but it was softer, more fluid. The land itself bore the marks of constant movement. Trails compacted soil. Grazing patterns shaped vegetation. Fire moved across regions following climate and fuel availability, rather than stopping at coastlines. Large-scale disturbances propagated farther, but also allowed for broader recovery. One of the less obvious effects of a land-connected world is cultural continuity. If we imagine humans or human-like beings in such a setting, ideas would spread the same way genes did. Slowly, unevenly, but without absolute barriers. Language, tools, and practices would diffuse across land routes, rather than being reinvented in isolation. This is speculative, of course, but it highlights how geography shapes not just biology, but behaviour. A connected world encourages shared solutions. A fragmented one encourages divergence. When Pangaea existed, the Earth's surface functioned more like a single neighbourhood than a collection of isolated regions. Differences existed, but they were part of a continuum. You could walk from one climate zone into another without ever stepping onto a boat. Even the concept of direction carried different weight. North, south, east, and west were not routes toward edges, but pathways through variation. Travelling north meant colder, not an ocean. Travelling east meant drier or wetter, not another continent. Over time, these patterns became deeply embedded in the structure of life. Movement was expected. Stasis was rare. Species that couldn't move or adapt gradually were more vulnerable. It's important to note that this did not make life easier. Harsh interiors, long distances, and extreme climates posed serious challenges. But those challenges were consistent. They didn't appear suddenly due to isolation. They shaped resilience over time. As the Earth continued to evolve internally, the conditions that supported this continuity slowly began to change. Stress built beneath the crust. Heat found new pathways. The land that once offered uninterrupted routes would eventually develop weak points. At first, these changes would not have disrupted movement. A shallow rift, a low basin, a new volcanic field. Roads were still land. Paths adjusted but did not end. Only much later would water begin to fill these low points, turning pathways into barriers. Only later would the idea of a road ending at an ocean become real. For now, in this earlier world, movement remained possible in all directions. Life spread, retreated, adapted, and returned. The planet supported a rhythm defined by connection rather than separation. When the land has no borders made of water, the climate follows different rules. Not gentler rules, not simpler ones, just different. On a unified continent, weather is not neatly divided by coastlines, and seasons are not softened by nearby oceans, unless you happen to live close to the edge of the world itself. Instead, climate stretches, blends, and intensifies as it moves across land without interruption. On Pangaea, climate did not belong to regions in the way it does today. It belonged to distance, elevation, latitude, and time. Heat travelled farther before losing strength. Cold did the same. Moisture became precious inland, not because rain was rare everywhere, but because oceans could not easily feed clouds deep into the continent. This created a planet where extremes were not isolated events, but defining features of large areas. Near the coasts, conditions were relatively familiar. Water moderated temperature. Seasons were steadier. Rainfall was more predictable. But as you moved inward, the influence of the ocean faded slowly, not suddenly. Each step away from the sea meant slightly drier air, slightly greater temperature swings, slightly harsher seasonal transitions. After hundreds or thousands of kilometres, the difference was profound. The interior of Pangaea experienced what climatologists call a continental climate taken to its logical extreme. Summers were hotter than most places on Earth today. Winters were colder. The absence of nearby water meant there was little to buffer these changes. Heat built up over land and stayed there. Cold settled in and lingered. This wasn't chaos. It was consistency. The same patterns repeated year after year, century after century, long enough for landscapes and life to adapt. Deserts formed not just because of low rainfall, but because evaporation outpaced precipitation over vast areas. These deserts were not small. They stretched across thousands of kilometres, broken occasionally by rivers or inland seas that appeared and vanished with longer climate cycles. Wind played an outsized role in shaping this world. With no oceans breaking up land masses, wind could travel immense distances uninterrupted. Seasonal winds transported heat, cold, and dust across the supercontinent. Fine sediments lifted from dry regions were carried far away, settling in layers that would later become rock. These windblown deposits still exist today, preserved in geological records on continents that are now oceans apart. Monsoon systems also behave differently. On a connected landmass, seasonal heating and cooling created powerful pressure differences between regions. This drove large-scale wind patterns that could bring intense rains to some areas while leaving others parched. Unlike modern monsoons, which are often influenced by nearby oceans, these systems were driven primarily by land itself, heating and cooling at different rates. Rainfall, when it came, could be sudden and intense. Long dry periods were sometimes broken by powerful storms that reshaped landscapes quickly. Rivers swelled, floodplains expanded, and temporary lakes formed. Then the rains would retreat, leaving behind fertile soils in some areas and salt flats in others. Temperature gradients were smoother but steeper. Moving north or south across Pangaea meant passing gradually through climate zones, without the interruption of ocean currents or maritime influences. Tropical regions were broader. Temperate zones were expansive. Polar regions existed, but their boundaries were less sharply defined. This had a significant effect on ice. Large permanent ice sheets were less common during much of Pangaea's existence. Not because the planet was always warm, but because the distribution of land and sea altered how ice accumulated and persisted. When ice did form, it often did so seasonally or in elevated regions rather than as massive continental sheets, like those seen in more fragmented eras. Mountain ranges influenced climate dramatically. As air masses were forced upward over high terrain, they cooled and dropped moisture on one side, creating wet regions, while the other side lay in rain shadow, becoming arid. These effects extended far beyond the mountains themselves, shaping entire regions downwind. Because Pangaea's mountain ranges were extensive and often aligned differently than modern ones, their climate effects were equally broad. Some areas experienced long-term aridity not because they were far from the sea, but because prevailing winds lost their moisture crossing high ground thousands of kilometres away. Ocean currents around the supercontinent also mattered. With a single global ocean, circulation patterns were less complex but more powerful. Warm currents moved heat efficiently around the planet's surface, while cold currents sank and returned through deep circulation. These movements influenced atmospheric patterns, which in turn affected climate across the land. However, because much of the land was clustered together, the ocean had less direct contact with continental interiors. This limited its ability to regulate temperature inland. As a result, climate zones were larger and more uniform over distance, but also more extreme within those zones. From the perspective of life, this created a world where adaptation to climate required endurance. Species had to tolerate wide temperature ranges or be capable of moving long distances to stay within suitable conditions. Plants evolved strategies to survive heat, cold, drought, and sudden floods. Animals developed migration behaviours tied closely to seasonal patterns rather than fixed locations. The lack of climatic borders also meant that climate-driven changes affected enormous areas simultaneously. A shift in global temperature didn't just alter one continent, it altered nearly all land at once. This amplified the impact of climate change events, but it also allowed life to respond collectively rather than in isolated pockets. Fire became an important force in many regions. Dry seasons and abundant vegetation created conditions for frequent fires. Without oceans to halt their spread, fires could move across large areas until natural barriers like rivers, mountains, or changes in vegetation stopped them. Over time, ecosystems adapted to this rhythm. Some plants relied on fire to reproduce. Some animals depended on post-fire landscapes for food. Dust storms were another defining feature. In arid interiors, fine particles were lifted and carried vast distances. This dust affected soil fertility far from its source. Regions downwind of deserts benefited from mineral-rich deposits that supported plant growth, while source regions slowly lost fine material, becoming rockier and less fertile. Climate feedback loops were strong. Vegetation influenced albedo, the reflectivity of the land, which affected how much heat was absorbed. Changes in vegetation cover altered rainfall patterns. These feedbacks played out over millions of years, shaping the stability and variability of different regions. Despite the extremes, the climate without borders was not uniformly hostile. Many areas supported rich ecosystems. Floodplains along major rivers were especially productive. Seasonal wetlands appeared and disappeared, creating dynamic habitats. Coastal regions, though fewer, were biologically active, benefiting from nutrient exchange between land and sea. The key difference from today's world is scale. Climate systems operated across the entire supercontinent rather than being compartmentalized by oceans. This made the Earth's climate feel more unified, but also less forgiving. When conditions changed, they changed broadly. As internal processes within the Earth continued to evolve, this climatic unity would begin to fracture. New rifts would alter wind patterns. Emerging seas would introduce new sources of moisture. Coastlines would multiply, breaking the long climatic gradients into smaller regions. But before that happened, climate shaped Pangaea as a single connected system. Heat, cold, wind, and rain moved freely across land, sculpting landscapes and life alike. Understanding this helps explain why the breakup of the supercontinent had such dramatic consequences. It wasn't just the land that divided, the climate itself became segmented. Patterns that once spanned half the planet were confined to smaller regions. Extremes softened in some places and intensified in others. For now, it's enough to stay with this image of a climate that did not stop at shorelines. A world where weather belonged to the land as a whole, moving slowly, powerfully, and without regard for the divisions that would one day define the Earth we know. Long before continents learned how to drift apart, long before oceans carved deep boundaries between ecosystems, the living world experienced Earth as a single, shared surface. Life did not recognize continents. It did not evolve with an understanding of separation by water. Instead, it responded to gradients, distances, climates, and opportunities that unfolded across an uninterrupted expanse of land. This continuity shaped the behaviour, movement and evolution of organisms in ways that feel unfamiliar to us now, because our modern world is defined by division. On a unified Earth, creatures did not belong to isolated corners of the planet. They belonged to belts of climate, to elevations, to soil types, to patterns of rainfall and temperature that stretched across thousands of kilometres. The idea of a species being from a specific continent would not have made much sense. What mattered was whether an organism could tolerate heat or cold, dryness or moisture, open plains or dense forests. If it could move. This does not mean that all life was evenly spread. Far from it. The interior of Pangaea posed serious challenges. Vast arid regions limited where plants could grow, and where plants could not grow, large herbivores struggled to survive. Predators followed prey, and prey followed vegetation. Life clustered where conditions allowed it to persist, but those clusters were connected by corridors rather than sealed off by oceans. For large animals, this connectivity was transformative. Migration was not a seasonal option limited by geography. It was a long-term survival strategy written into evolution itself. Over generations, populations could shift their ranges gradually in response to climate change. If temperatures warmed in one region, animals did not need to rapidly adapt or face extinction. They could move. If a habitat dried out, they could follow rivers or seasonal rains toward more favourable areas. This mobility reduced the pressure for extreme specialisation. In a fragmented world, species often evolve to fit very narrow niches, because leaving those niches is impossible. On a unified continent, flexibility was more valuable. Traits that allowed tolerance across a range of conditions were favoured. Diets were broader, behaviours were adaptable, body plans reflected endurance and efficiency over long distances. Herbivores in particular benefited from this openness. Large plant eaters could roam vast areas in search of food, reducing the risk of overgrazing any one region. Their movement shaped landscapes. Grazing patterns influenced which plants dominated. Trampled soil affected water absorption. Seeds were carried far from their parent plants, increasing genetic mixing and promoting widespread plant lineages. Predators adapted to this roaming prey. Instead of defending small territories, many would have followed migratory routes, relying on endurance and coordination rather than ambush in confined spaces. This favoured sensory awareness, stamina, and social behaviours in some lineages. Hunting strategies were shaped by openness rather than confinement. Smaller animals experienced the unified Earth differently, but still profoundly. For insects, reptiles, amphibians, and early mammals, continuity meant that populations could expand slowly into new areas without crossing water. This allowed gradual adaptation along environmental gradients. Instead of sudden isolation, change happened step by step. This had important evolutionary consequences. Speciation still occurred, but it often happened through ecological divergence rather than geographic isolation. A population adapting to drier conditions would slowly differentiate from one adapting to wetter ones, even while remaining loosely connected. Genetic differences accumulated, but barriers were rarely absolute. Plants followed similar patterns. Seed dispersal over long distances was common, aided by wind, animals, and water flow across land. Forests could spread continuously until climate or soil limited them. Grasslands expanded and contracted with rainfall patterns. Plant communities blended into one another rather than ending abruptly at coastlines. This blending created broad transitional zones where species overlapped. These zones were often biologically rich, supporting diverse interactions. Competition was constant. Adaptation was ongoing. Life on a unified Earth was dynamic, not because it faced constant disruption, but because it existed in a continuous web of interactions. One of the most striking aspects of this world is how it limited endemism. In today's fragmented world, isolation creates unique species found nowhere else. On Pangaea, true isolation was rare and often temporary. As a result, fewer species were confined to extremely small ranges. Those that were tended to occupy specialized environments like high mountains or unusual soils. This does not mean diversity was low. It means diversity was distributed differently. Instead of many narrowly endemic species, there were fewer but more widely distributed ones, with variation expressed across their ranges. Diversity existed within species as much as between them. Disease and parasites also followed this connectivity. Pathogens could spread gradually with their hosts. This favoured immune resilience over naive vulnerability. Populations were constantly exposed to a broader range of biological challenges, which shaped their defences over time. Extinction events played out differently as well. When conditions worsened in one area, species were not immediately trapped. Migration provided a buffer. Extinction still occurred, especially during major climate shifts or volcanic events, but recovery often drew from surviving populations elsewhere on the landmass. Aquatic life was influenced by this unified world too. Freshwater ecosystems were often interconnected through river networks that spanned the continent. Fish and amphibians could disperse through these systems, spreading genetic material and adapting to different conditions along the way. Inland seas created unique environments that acted as temporary hubs of aquatic diversity before disappearing again. The absence of multiple oceans also shaped marine life. With one dominant global ocean, marine ecosystems were less compartmentalized. Species could spread widely, following currents that circled the planet. Coastal ecosystems were fewer, but those that existed were extensive and dynamic. Life on land and sea was not isolated from each other. Nutrient exchange occurred where rivers met the ocean, but also through atmospheric transport of dust and organic material. This linked terrestrial and marine ecosystems in subtle ways. Behaviourally, creatures on a unified Earth evolved expectations of continuity. Movement was a normal response to change. Staying put was risky if conditions shifted. This favoured instincts tied to exploration, migration, and adaptability. If intelligent life had existed then, its worldview would have been shaped by this openness. There would be no natural sense of elsewhere separated by water. The unknown would lie over land, reachable with time and effort. Cultural myths, if they existed, would likely focus on distance rather than separation. The unified Earth also meant that evolutionary innovations could spread rapidly. A successful adaptation in one region could, over time, propagate across the continent. This created waves of change rather than isolated experiments. When flowering plants later emerged, for example, their spread would have been influenced by such connectivity. It's important to recognise that this world was not peaceful or balanced in a gentle sense. Competition was intense. Resources were contested. Climate extremes tested survival constantly, but the rules were consistent. The playing field was wide open. As the Earth's internal dynamics continued to evolve, the conditions that allowed this biological continuity slowly began to change. Subtle shifts in climate patterns, rising volcanic activity in certain regions, and the thinning of crust along future rift zones began to alter habitats. At first, these changes did not create barriers. Life adjusted, as it always had. But eventually the first real divisions would appear. Shallow seas would form. Land bridges would narrow. Migration routes would become constrained. Species would find themselves cut off not by distance, but by water. When that happened, the evolutionary game changed. Isolation became a dominant force. Diversity began to fragment. Unique lineages emerged in separation. Understanding the creatures of a unified Earth helps us see how profound that change was. Fragmentation did not just rearrange land, it rewrote the rules of life. Forests on a unified Earth were not the neat, contained regions we're used to imagining today. They were not pockets of green bounded by oceans, deserts, or mountain chains that abruptly cut growth short. Instead, forests during the age of a single supercontinent behaved more like slow-moving systems, expanding and retreating across enormous distances in response to climate, soil, fire, and time. In some periods, these forests did not merely dominate regions. They spanned vast portions of the planet connected not by human pathways or mapped borders, but by continuity itself. To understand what it means for a forest to span half the planet, it helps to discard modern assumptions. Today, forests feel local. The Amazon is distant from the Congo. Boreal forests belong to the north. Tropical rainforests feel separate from temperate woodlands. These divisions exist largely because water separates land masses and interrupts ecological flow. On Pangaea, those interruptions were absent. Forests grew until something stopped them, and often that something was not distance. Climate was the primary architect. Where rainfall patterns allowed sustained plant growth, forests emerged. Where they did not, forests thinned or vanished. Because climate zones on Pangaea stretched broadly across land rather than being broken by oceans, forest belts could extend uninterrupted for thousands of kilometres. A forest did not end so much as it slowly changed character as conditions shifted. Near the equatorial regions of the supercontinent, warmth and seasonal rainfall supported dense plant growth. These were not modern rainforests as we know them, filled with flowering plants and familiar canopies, but earlier forest systems dominated by ancient plant groups. Tree-like ferns, seed ferns, early conifers, and towering club mosses formed layered environments that captured light and recycled moisture efficiently. These forests were not static. Over long spans of time, their composition shifted as climate cycles unfolded. Wet periods allowed expansion, drier periods caused retreat. But because land remained connected, retreat did not necessarily mean collapse. Forests migrated. As conditions changed, forest boundaries moved gradually across the landscape. Species that could tolerate slight differences in temperature or moisture advanced into newly suitable areas. Others retreated, but survived elsewhere. The forest itself behaved like a living front, advancing and withdrawing without ever fully disappearing from the continent. Soil played a crucial role. Forests require not just water and warmth, but nutrients. On Pangaea, large river systems transported sediment across long distances, depositing fertile soils far inland. Volcanic activity replenished minerals. Dust blown from arid regions settled in forested areas, adding trace elements essential for plant growth. This constant redistribution supported forests even far from coastlines. The scale of these systems is difficult to imagine. A single forest belt could stretch from what we would now call the tropics into temperate regions, changing gradually in structure and species composition along the way. There was no sudden shift from forest to grassland marked by an ocean breeze or a coastline. Transitions were slow and subtle. Fire was an integral part of this world. In many forested regions, seasonal dryness made fires inevitable. Without oceans to interrupt them, fires could spread across enormous areas, reshaping forests on continental scales. But fire was not purely destructive. Many plant species depended on it. Some required heat to release seeds. Others regenerated quickly after burns, outcompeting less fire-tolerant plants. These fire cycles created mosaics within forests. Patches of older growth existed alongside younger regrowth. This diversity of structure supported a wide range of animals, from insects to large herbivores. Fire also prevented forests from becoming uniformly dense, allowing light to reach the ground and sustaining undergrowth. The animals living within these forests adapted to their scale. Arboreal species could move through canopies that seemed endless. Ground-dwelling animals navigated complex understories filled with fallen trunks, ferns, and leaf litter. Large herbivores fed on abundant vegetation, shaping plant communities through grazing and browsing. Because forests were connected, animal populations within them were not isolated. Genetic exchange occurred over long distances, even if slowly. This reduced the likelihood of extreme specialization tied to very narrow habitats. Flexibility was favored. Species that could tolerate a range of forest conditions thrived. Forests also influenced climate in return. Large forested areas affected atmospheric circulation by releasing moisture through transpiration. This moisture contributed to cloud formation and rainfall, reinforcing the conditions that allowed forests to persist. In this way, forests and climate formed feedback loops that stabilized ecosystems over long periods. The presence of massive forests affected carbon cycling as well. Forests absorbed carbon dioxide and stored it in biomass and soils. Over time, dead plant material accumulated and in some cases was buried and preserved. Much of the coal we mine today originated from ancient forests that existed on supercontinents, compressed and transformed over millions of years. These carbon-rich environments shaped atmospheric composition. Oxygen levels fluctuated over geological time, sometimes reaching higher concentrations than today. This influenced animal physiology. Higher oxygen levels allowed for larger body sizes in some organisms, particularly insects and amphibians. Forests on Pangaea were not uniformly wet or lush. Many were seasonal. Trees adapted to periods of drought by shedding leaves or slowing growth. Others developed thick bark or deep root systems. The idea of a forest as a constantly green, rain-soaked environment does not capture the diversity of these systems. Inland forests, far from any ocean influence, face particularly harsh conditions. They endured temperature extremes and irregular rainfall, yet they persisted because of scale. Even if one region suffered drought, another nearby might not. The forest as a whole survived by shifting its centre of activity. This continuity also allowed forests to recover from disturbances that might have been catastrophic in a fragmented world. After volcanic eruptions or climate shifts, recolonization could occur from surrounding areas. Species did not have to cross oceans to return. Seeds and spores travelled by wind, animals and water across land. The edges of forests were dynamic zones. Where forests met grasslands or deserts, competition was constant. Trees advanced during wetter periods and retreated during drier ones. These boundaries moved slowly, often over thousands of years, creating layered records in soils and sediments. In some periods, forests may indeed have covered close to half the planet's land surface. This does not mean continuous dense canopy everywhere, but interconnected forest-dominated systems stretching across continents. Such scale would have been unprecedented in today's fragmented world. The breakup of the supercontinent would eventually disrupt these vast systems. As land began to separate and oceans formed, forest belts were severed. Climate patterns shifted. Moisture sources changed. What was once a continuous system became fragmented into regional forests. This fragmentation had profound effects. Isolated forests evolved independently. Species diverged. Some adapted to new conditions, others vanished. The global feedback loops that once stabilized climate weakened or changed form. Understanding forests that spanned half the planet helps us see how interconnected Earth systems once were. Forests were not just collections of trees, they were planetary scale regulators of climate, carbon, and life itself. There was a kind of quiet that existed on Earth before oceans learned how to speak to the land the way they do now. Not silence in the sense of absence, because the planet was never truly quiet, but a different balance of sound, motion, and influence. Water was present, abundant even, but it did not yet dominate the conversation. It had not carved deep boundaries. It had not inserted itself into every climate system, every ecosystem, every edge of life. Before the oceans spread wide and deep, the land spoke mostly to itself. On a unified Earth, water behaved differently. There was a global ocean, vast beyond anything we experience today, but its relationship with the land was limited by geography. Fewer coastlines meant fewer places where waves met rock. Fewer shallow seas meant less interaction between ocean currents and continental interiors. Much of the land existed beyond the ocean's immediate reach, and that distance mattered. The modern world is loud with ocean influence. Winds pick up moisture from the sea and drop it inland. Storms are born over warm waters. Currents transport heat around the planet. Tides rise and fall against countless shores. Even when we're far from the coast, the ocean is still shaping the air we breathe and the weather we experience. On Pangaea, much of the land existed outside that reach. This created a quieter kind of planet. Not calmer, not gentler, but less interrupted. Weather patterns developed over land and remained land-driven. Winds did not constantly reset themselves at coastlines. Moisture did not endlessly cycle between sea and shore. Instead, atmospheric systems built slowly, travelled far, and dissipated only when they exhausted their energy. Inland regions experienced a kind of climatic isolation that feels almost alien to us now. Rainfall did not arrive because a warm current evaporated water nearby. It arrived because large-scale temperature differences forced air upward. When it rained, it often did so intensely. When it did not, dryness lingered. This rhythm shaped landscapes with patience rather than variety. Without frequent coastal interaction, erosion worked differently. Rivers carved channels, but they did not always rush toward the sea. Many slowed, spread out, and vanished into basins or evaporated under the sun. Sediment accumulated inland rather than being constantly flushed into oceans. Over millions of years, this built thick layers of soil and rock far from any shoreline. The absence of many shallow seas also reduced the constant churning that characterizes modern coastal ecosystems. Today, continental shelves teem with life because they are shallow, nutrient-rich, and constantly mixed by waves and tides. On Pangaea, these environments were rarer. Marine life existed, but it was often concentrated in different zones, shaped by broad currents rather than intricate coastlines. This affected sound in a literal sense as well. Waves breaking against shorelines generate constant noise. Tides move water rhythmically. Coastal winds carry the sound of surf far inland. On a supercontinent with fewer coasts, vast regions would have known none of this. The dominant sounds would have been wind over land, movement of animals, fire, rain when it came, and long stretches of stillness between. It's difficult to reconstruct soundscapes from geology, but we can infer patterns from structure. A land-dominated planet emphasizes terrestrial processes. The ocean remains present, immense, and powerful, but distant. It influences the planet as a whole, rather than whispering directly to every region. This distance changed how life interacted with water. Freshwater systems became central. Rivers, lakes, wetlands, and seasonal basins were the primary sources of hydration for inland ecosystems. Life clustered around them, adapted to their cycles, and followed their movements. When water shifted, life shifted with it. Because oceans did not constantly intrude inland through weather systems, freshwater environments were more variable. Some years they expanded, other years they shrank or vanished. This variability favoured resilience. Species that depended on permanent water were limited in range. Those that could survive dry periods thrived. The silence before ocean spoke was not emptiness. It was a different hierarchy of influence. Land dictated climate first, water responded second. In today's world, that relationship is often reversed. This also affected temperature regulation. Oceans store and release heat slowly, moderating climate. Without that moderation inland, temperature swings were sharper. Days could be scorching. Nights could cool quickly. Seasonal differences were pronounced. Life adapted by timing activity, burrowing, migrating, or developing insulating features. Even the sky behaved differently. Cloud formation inland relied heavily on land-driven convection rather than maritime moisture. This produced dramatic skies, towering clouds built over heated land. Storms could be sudden and intense, but also localized. Large areas might go long periods without precipitation. The silence extended into geological time. Coastal erosion is relentless. Waves grind rock into sand. Tides reshape shorelines constantly. With fewer coasts, much of the land escaped this continual reshaping. Landscapes change slowly, guided by wind, water flow and gravity rather than endless wave action. This allowed certain geological features to persist longer. River valleys deepened steadily. Plateaus eroded gradually. Sedimentary layers accumulated without frequent disturbance. The land recorded its history quietly, layer by layer. Marine ecosystems, too, experienced a different kind of stability. With one dominant ocean and fewer continental interruptions, currents followed broad, predictable paths. Nutrient distribution was less complex but more uniform on large scales. Species spread widely, encountering fewer barriers. The interaction between marine and terrestrial life was more limited but not absent. Where rivers met the ocean, exchanges occurred. Nutrients flowed outward. Marine organisms ventured inland only where conditions allowed. These interfaces were fewer but significant. As a result, evolutionary pressures differed. Coastal specialization was less prominent simply because coastlines were less extensive. Inland adaptation mattered more. Life's relationship with water was mediated through land rather than sea. This silence also shaped the chemistry of the atmosphere. Oceans absorb and release gases, influencing carbon dioxide and oxygen levels. With reduced interaction between ocean and land, these exchanges followed different patterns. Over long periods, this contributed to shifts in atmospheric composition that affected life's possibilities. Higher oxygen levels during certain periods may be linked in part to extensive forests and reduced coastal mixing. These changes allowed for larger body sizes and different metabolic strategies among animals. It's important not to romanticize this world as peaceful or balanced. Silence does not mean comfort. The interior of Pangaea could be brutal, extended droughts, extreme heat, sudden floods. But the challenges were predictable in a broad sense. They followed rhythms that repeated over long spans of time. Life adapted to those rhythms deeply. Generations were shaped by consistency rather than surprise. Change occurred slowly enough to be met with movement and adaptation, rather than sudden extinction. The silence before oceans spoke also meant that when they finally did begin to speak more loudly, the effect was profound. As rifts opened and seas formed, new sounds entered the planet's systems. Waves broke where none had before. Moisture cycled inland more readily. Climate patterns fractured into smaller, more complex systems. The quiet, land-dominated world began to hear the constant voice of water. Weather became more variable, ecosystems fragmented. The steady rhythms of inland life were interrupted by maritime influence. This transition did not happen all at once. At first, shallow seas whispered rather than shouted. They filled low basins. They created narrow coastlines. Their influence was local, but over time, as oceans widened, their voice grew stronger. Understanding the silence that came before helps explain why this shift mattered so much. It wasn't just a geological event, it was a rebalancing of influence. Water moved from the background to the foreground. For now, it's enough to sit with this earlier world. A land that spoke mostly to itself. A planet where oceans existed, immense and powerful but distant. A time before waves shaped every edge, before tide set the rhythm, before water learned how to speak loudly enough for the whole earth to listen. For a very long time, the surface of the earth gave no clear sign that it intended to break itself apart. The land held together. Forests expanded and retreated. Rivers shifted their courses. Creatures migrated, adapted, and disappeared. Climate rose and fell in slow, familiar rhythms. From above, if such a perspective had existed, the world would have looked whole, continuous, settled into its form. But beneath that apparent calm, something was changing. The calm did not end suddenly. It did not shatter. It thinned. Cracks in the calm did not begin as visible fractures slicing across the land. They began as imbalances deep below the surface, where heat, pressure, and motion slowly reorganized themselves. The Earth did not decide to pull apart. It drifted toward that outcome because the forces that once favored unity were no longer distributed in the same way. At the heart of this shift was heat. The planet had been cooling since its formation, releasing internal energy through convection in the mantle. For hundreds of millions of years, this process supported the cohesion of the crust. Heat circulated broadly, stress spread out. The lithosphere bent and flexed rather than tearing. But cooling is not uniform. Over immense spans of time, patterns change. Certain regions beneath the supercontinent began to accumulate more heat than others. Mantle material rose slowly in plumes, pressing upward against the base of the crust. At first, this did very little at the surface. The land did not crack open. There were no dramatic rifts. Instead, the crust warmed, softened, and thinned almost imperceptibly. A thinner crust behaves differently from a thick one. It resists pressure less effectively. It stretches more easily. It transfers stress upward rather than absorbing it. These changes did not announce themselves with earthquakes large enough to reshape the world. They announced themselves with subtle shifts in elevation, with regions that began to sit slightly higher or lower than before. In some places the land gently swelled. In others, it sagged. Rivers adjusted their paths. Drainage basins widened or narrowed. Inland seas appeared where water collected in newly formed lowlands. To life on the surface, these changes would have seemed ordinary. Landscapes always change. Hills rise and erode. Lakes come and go. Nothing about this suggested a planetary transformation underway. Volcanic activity provided another hint, though again not an obvious one. Volcanoes had always existed on Pangea, but their distribution began to shift. Instead of being concentrated mainly at ancient collision zones, volcanic regions appeared within the interior of the landmass. Lava flows spread across plains that had once been stable. Ash settled over forests and grasslands. Volcanism releases gases into the atmosphere, including carbon dioxide and sulfur compounds. Over time, this altered climate subtly. Temperatures fluctuated. Rainfall patterns adjusted. These changes put additional stress on ecosystems already adapted to consistency. Still, life endured. It always had. The cracks in the calm were not only physical, they were systemic. As heat flow changed, so did the balance between different geological processes. Where the crust thinned, tension built. Where tension built, the rock stretched. Stretching creates faults, small at first, barely noticeable. These faults did not tear the land apart, they whispered instead. A fault is not a break. It is a weakness, a place where rock has shifted slightly, where stress has been released just enough to prevent catastrophe, but not enough to restore balance. Over time, these weaknesses accumulate. They link, they align. In some regions, networks of faults formed beneath the surface. Above them, the land might have appeared unchanged, but underground, pathways were opening. Magma found easier routes upward. Heat escaped more readily. The cycle fed itself. As faults developed, the crust began to stretch laterally. Stretching thins rock further. Thin rock heats faster. Heated rock stretches more easily. This feedback loop unfolded over tens of millions of years. Still no sudden rupture. Still no ocean. Just a gradual loss of structural integrity. The calm world before separation was not fragile. It was resilient. That resilience is what made the transition so slow. The Earth resisted breaking itself apart. It redistributed stress again and again. But resistance does not mean permanence. It means delay. One of the most important aspects of this period is how uneven it was. Not all regions experienced these changes equally. Some areas remained thick, cool, and stable. Others became increasingly strained. This unevenness mattered because it determined where separation would eventually begin. The supercontinent did not split down the middle. It began to fray at its edges and along ancient scars, old collision zones where continents had once slammed together to form Pangea were zones of weakness. The crust there was thick but complex, layered with faults from past events. These regions responded differently to new stresses than simpler, younger crust. At the same time, areas far from these ancient scars were not immune. Mantle plumes could weaken any region given enough time. The location of future oceans was not predetermined in a simple sense. It emerged from the interaction between old structures and new forces. From the surface, life continued much as before. Forests still expanded and burned. Animals still migrated. Rivers still flowed. But the ground beneath them was slowly changing its relationship with itself. The land that had once been a single, confident mass was beginning to hesitate. This hesitation expressed itself in small but persistent ways. Earthquakes became more frequent in certain regions, though not necessarily more intense. The land flexed and shifted. Some areas experienced long-term uplift. Others sank. Shorelines changed shape. Inland seas expanded and became more persistent. These inland seas were particularly significant. They marked places where the crust had thinned enough to sit lower relative to sea level. Water flowed in not from newly formed oceans, but from rivers and rainfall. Over time, these basins deepened. Salt accumulated as water evaporated. Life adapted to brackish conditions. In hindsight, these basins were precursors. They were rehearsal spaces for the oceans that would eventually form. But at the time, they were simply part of the landscape, another feature in a world accustomed to change. The calm also cracked chemically. As volcanic activity increased, atmospheric composition shifted. Carbon dioxide levels rose and fell, oxygen levels fluctuated. These changes influenced temperature and plant growth. Forests responded by shifting their ranges. Some expanded, others retreated. The great interconnected systems remained intact, but their internal balance wavered. Fire regimes changed too. Drier conditions in some regions increased fire frequency. Fires reshaped ecosystems, favouring certain plant strategies over others. This altered fuel availability and further influenced climate locally. These cascading effects illustrate something important. The cracks in the calm were not isolated events. They were interconnected. Geological changes influenced climate. Climate influenced ecosystems. Ecosystems fed back into climate. The entire system began to behave less like a steady equilibrium and more like a dynamic one edging toward reorganization. Still, nothing yet resembled the modern Earth. There were no oceans splitting continents, no isolated land masses drifting apart, no sense, from the perspective of life, that the world itself was ending. The calm cracked, but it did not shatter. This matters because it reminds us how gradual Earth's most dramatic changes really are. We tend to imagine continental breakup as a violent tearing, a sudden event. In reality, it is the outcome of millions of years of quiet preparation. The violence, when it comes, is localized. The true transformation is slow. As stresses accumulated, certain regions reached a tipping point. The crust there could no longer stretch without breaking. Magma intruded along faults, solidifying and forcing rock apart. The land began to open, not widely, but enough to mark a new phase. These early rifts were narrow. They did not immediately fill with seawater. They were valleys, elongated depressions bordered by faults. Volcanic activity intensified along them. Heat flowed upward more efficiently. The land on either side slowly moved apart by centimetres per year. Centimetres are easy to dismiss. Over a human lifetime, they mean nothing. Over 1,000,000 years, they mean everything. The cracks in the calm did not announce the end of Pangaea, but they made it inevitable. Once rifting begins, it tends to continue. Stretching begets more stretching. Weakness attracts stress. The system reorganizes around the new configuration. For most of Earth's history, the ground did not feel like something that wandered. It rose, it sank, it cracked, it healed, but it stayed where it was. Mountains formed and wore down in the same general places. Rivers shifted their courses, but the land beneath them felt anchored, dependable in its position, even if not in its shape. When the ground began to wander, that sense of permanence quietly dissolved. Not in a way any living thing could immediately notice, but in a way that would eventually redefine the planet. The wandering did not begin as motion in the way we understand motion. There was no sliding, no drifting continents gliding past one another like slow ships. What began instead was separation, stretching, a subtle but persistent pulling apart that turned solid ground into something more flexible, more uncertain. After the first cracks formed beneath the calm surface, the Earth entered a new phase. The forces that once redistributed stress internally now found release through extension. Instead of pushing land together or allowing it to bend, the mantle began to pull sections of the crust outward. This was not a single event or a single location. It happened unevenly in fits and starts across zones of weakness that had been quietly forming for millions of years. As the crust stretched, it thinned. As it thinned, it sank. Long, shallow valleys appeared, bounded by faults where blocks of land slid downward relative to their neighbours. These were rift valleys, though at the time they would not have been recognised as the beginnings of oceans. They were simply elongated lowlands, often warm, often volcanic, often filled with lakes and rivers. The ground began to wander not because it moved as a whole, but because its pieces began to behave independently. Where once the supercontinent functioned as a single, mechanically unified surface, it now started to act like a system of connected but semi-autonomous regions. Stress no longer travelled freely across the entire landmass. It accumulated locally. It released locally. This localization changed everything. Volcanism intensified along these rift zones. Magma rose through thinning crust more easily, erupting at the surface or intruding beneath it. Lava flows covered wide areas, creating new rock that was dense, dark, and hot. Over time, this volcanic material added weight, causing further subsidence. The land sagged more, the rifts deepened. Heat altered the chemistry of the surrounding rock. Minerals recrystallized. Fluid circulated through fractures, depositing metals and changing the structure of the crust. These processes weakened the land further, making continued stretching easier. What had begun as hesitation became momentum. Still, the wandering was slow. On the scale of a human lifetime, it was invisible. Even over thousands of years, it would have been impossible to detect without instruments that did not yet exist. But over millions of years, the effects accumulated. Valleys widened, faults lengthened. The distance between once adjacent regions increased by meters, then kilometers. This was the first true movement of continents relative to one another, even though the continents themselves had not yet separated. It was motion without water, drift without oceans. The ground was learning a new behaviour. One of the most striking aspects of this phase is how incomplete it was. The land did not break cleanly, it stretched unevenly. Some rift zones stalled and healed, their faults filled with sediment and volcanic rock. Others continued to open. The Earth experimented in a sense with where and how to divide itself. Climate responded to this wandering ground. Rift valleys created new lowlands that trapped heat. Volcanic gases altered atmospheric composition. Local climates shifted. Rainfall patterns adjusted as topography changed. Lakes formed along rifts, sometimes becoming deep, long-lived bodies of water that supported unique ecosystems. Life adapted quickly, as it always does. Plants colonized fresh volcanic soils. Animals followed new water sources. The rift valleys became corridors of change, places where ecosystems were reshaped repeatedly. They were dynamic landscapes in an otherwise still unified world. As stretching continued, something else began to happen beneath the surface. The mantle material rising beneath rifts cooled and solidified, forming new crust. This crust was different from the old continental crust. It was denser, thinner, and more uniform. It resembled what we now recognize as oceanic crust, though no ocean yet existed above it. This distinction matters. Continental crust is buoyant. It resists sinking. Oceanic crust is heavier. It sits lower. As more of this denser material formed beneath rift zones, the land above sank further. Eventually some rifts dropped below sea level. At first, water entered cautiously. Rivers flowed into the lowest parts of rift valleys. Lakes expanded. Salinity increased as evaporation concentrated minerals. Life adjusted again. These inland seas were not yet oceans. They were transitional environments, shaped by both land and water. But once water reached the rift from the global ocean, everything changed. Even a narrow connection allowed seawater to flood in. Salt water altered chemistry. Tides introduced new rhythms. Marine organisms followed. The land, which had once spoken mostly to itself, began to hear the ocean's voice. This was the moment when wandering became unmistakable. Water does not tolerate ambiguity. It fills space. It marks change. When seawater entered a rift, it announced that separation was no longer theoretical. Still, the continents did not immediately drift apart as isolated units. They were tethered by thick crust in other regions. The supercontinent stretched like a fabric being pulled at several points. Some areas thinned dramatically. Others remained intact. The motion itself was driven by mantle convection, slab dynamics, and gravitational forces, but from the surface it would have felt like a slow loosening. Mountains that had once been central shifted toward edges. Drainage patterns reorganized. Rivers reversed direction, or were captured by new basins. The wandering ground also changed how stress was released elsewhere. As rifts absorbed extension, other regions experienced compression. Mountains rose far from the rift zones. Old faults reactivated. The Earth adjusted globally to local changes. This interconnected response highlights a crucial point. Continental drift is not simply about continents moving apart. It is about the redistribution of forces across the entire planet. When one region stretches, another must respond. The Earth remains a closed system. Over time, the wandering ground created clear lines of future separation. The shapes of modern continents are foreshadowed in these ancient rifts. The Atlantic Ocean, for example, traces its origins to a network of rift valleys that once cut through Pangea's interior. What began as wandering ground became a permanent divide. Yet even as these lines formed, the world remained largely connected. Animals could still cross. Forests still spanned vast areas. Climate systems still operated on continental scales. The wandering was underway, but the consequences were still unfolding. This prolonged in-between state is easy to overlook. We tend to jump from Pangaea whole to continents apart. In reality, the transition lasted tens of millions of years. During that time, the Earth was neither fully unified nor fully divided. It was something else entirely. Life lived through this ambiguity. Species experienced gradual changes in habitat connectivity. Migration routes narrowed but did not vanish. Genetic exchange decreased but did not stop. Evolution began to feel the pull of separation before separation was complete. This period likely produced tension within ecosystems. Some species thrived in newly formed environments, others struggled as familiar landscapes fragmented. The rules were changing, but not all at once. The wandering ground also affected time in a geological sense. Rates of sedimentation changed, erosion patterns shifted. The rock record from this era is complex, layered with signals of both continuity and disruption. As rifting progressed, the likelihood of reversal decreased. Once enough thinning occurred, once enough new crust formed, the process became self-sustaining. The ground did not wander back, it continued outward. From here, the story accelerates, not in speed, but in consequence. The next phase brings true separation. Oceans widen, continents become distinct entities, climate fragments, life begins to diverge more sharply. But it's important to recognise this wandering phase for what it was. Not a sudden upheaval, not a catastrophic tearing, but a long, uncertain transition. The Earth learning a new way to move. The ground did not abandon its past all at once. It carried its history forward even as it changed direction. Old mountains, ancient soils, long-established ecosystems all persisted, reshaped rather than erased. The moment a world begins to pull itself apart is rarely dramatic at first. There is no single line you can draw and say, this is where unity ended. Instead, separation announces itself through persistence. What once flexed and recovered no longer does. What once hesitated now commits. The Earth, having learned how to wander, begins the longer, quieter act of letting go. A world slowly pulling apart does not feel like destruction to those living within it. It feels like rearrangement. Familiar landscapes remain, but their relationships change. Distances grow subtly, connections narrow. What was once easy becomes possible but effortful. What was once possible becomes uncertain. As rift zones continue to stretch, they did not do so uniformly. Some widened steadily, others stalled, others shifted location entirely as stress migrated through the crust. The supercontinent did not unzip along a clean seam. It frayed. Multiple regions experienced extension at once, competing, interacting, sometimes reinforcing each other, sometimes cancelling out. Where rifting succeeded, the crust thinned beyond recovery. Magma rose continuously, solidifying into new crust that was fundamentally different from the old continental rock. This new crust was denser and sat lower, allowing water to collect permanently. Shallow seas formed not as temporary features, but as enduring ones. These seas widened gradually, fed by continued stretching and subsidence. Water is an amplifier of change. Once present, it accelerates processes that land alone handles slowly. Waves erode exposed rock. Salt alters mineral stability. Tides introduce rhythmic stress. Even shallow seas begin to reshape their margins more actively than rivers or wind ever could. As these seas expanded, they began to interrupt migration routes that had existed for millions of years. At first, the interruptions were narrow. Animals could cross at certain times, along land bridges exposed during low water levels or along chains of higher ground. Plants could disperse seeds across gaps with wind or animals. Genetic exchange continued, but it weakened. This weakening mattered. Evolution responds not only to isolation, but to the reduction of connection. When movement becomes less reliable, populations adapt locally. Traits that once spread across the continent now remained confined. Differences accumulated more quickly. The first hints of continental individuality emerged, not in geography, but in biology. Climate responded as well. Even narrow seas altered atmospheric circulation. Water absorbed heat during warm periods and released it slowly, moderating temperature extremes nearby. Rainfall patterns shifted. Regions that had once experienced harsh continental climates began to soften at their edges. Interior regions remained extreme, but the gradients changed. As seas widened, their influence grew. Moisture travelled farther inland, storm systems reorganised. The unified climate belts of the supercontinent began to fragment into regional patterns. This fragmentation did not erase existing ecosystems, but it reshaped them. Forests retreated from some areas and advanced into others. Grasslands expanded where rainfall became more seasonal. The pulling apart of the world also changed how rivers behaved. Drainage systems that once flowed across the interior toward distant basins were disrupted. Some rivers were captured by new seas, reversing direction. Others were cut off, forming inland lakes. Sediment that once travelled far inland now accumulated along new coastlines. These new coastlines were dynamic. They advanced and retreated with sea level changes driven by climate and tectonics. Life colonised them quickly. Coastal ecosystems emerged where none had existed before, introducing new food webs and new evolutionary pressures. Marine life took advantage of these changes. Shallow seas are biologically productive. Nutrients from land-fed algae and plankton, fish and invertebrates followed. The interface between land and sea multiplied, creating opportunities for adaptation and diversification. At the same time, the interior of the supercontinent began to feel more isolated. As seas expanded, distances across uninterrupted land increased in practical terms, even if not in absolute distance. Movement became more constrained by geography. Migration routes narrowed. Populations that once interacted regularly now did so rarely. This slow isolation did not cause immediate extinctions. It caused divergence. Species began to follow different evolutionary paths in different regions. Some adaptations proved successful locally, but would have failed elsewhere. Diversity increased, not because life was thriving everywhere, but because it was experimenting independently. The world pulling apart also experienced changes in stress distribution. As some regions extended, others compressed. Mountain building occurred far from rift zones. Old mountain ranges were rejuvenated. New highlands formed, altering climate and drainage patterns further. This global redistribution of stress highlights how interconnected the process was. Continental breakup is not simply tearing, it is rebalancing. The Earth adjusts its entire surface to accommodate local changes. Over tens of millions of years, the outlines of future continents became clearer, not as sharp borders, but as regions that behaved increasingly independently. Their climates diverged, their ecosystems differentiated, their geological histories began to follow separate trajectories. Still, the separation was incomplete. Land bridges persisted. Shallow seas could retreat during periods of lower sea level. Temporary reconnections occurred. The world did not pull apart in a straight line toward isolation. It pulsed, advancing and retreating, testing configurations. Life experienced this as uncertainty. Some species adapted to crossing water occasionally, others retreated to safer ranges. Plants with floating seeds or spores gained an advantage. Animals capable of swimming or rafting found new opportunities. The pulling apart also affected timescales of change. Processes that once took millions of years to propagate across the continent now occurred regionally. Evolution accelerated in some places. Extinction risk increased in others. The unified resilience of a connected world weakened. Yet it's important to remember that this was not a collapse. It was a transformation. The Earth did not become less alive. It became differently alive. New niches formed. New interactions emerged. Complexity increased. As oceans widened, they began to speak more loudly. Their rhythms imposed new cycles on coastal regions. Tides influenced daily activity. Salinity gradients shaped estuaries. Marine and terrestrial systems became more intertwined at their boundaries. The silence of the earlier world faded. In its place emerged a more complex, more variable planet. One where change arrived from multiple directions rather than flowing slowly across land. For creatures living through this era, memory would not have registered a before and after. There was only continuity of experience, punctuated by gradual shifts. Forests still existed, animals still migrated, the sky still followed familiar patterns. But the underlying structure of the world was changing. The Earth pulling apart did not erase its past. Ancient rocks remained. Old soils persisted. Many species survived and adapted. But the future would no longer be shared in the same way. The world was learning how to become plural. As separation continued, the likelihood of reunion decreased. Once oceanic crust forms and widens, it rarely closes quickly. The continents began to commit to their paths. Their motion became directional. Their independence increased. From this point on, the story becomes one of divergence, not just of land, but of climate histories, evolutionary experiments, and cultural possibilities that would emerge much later. But that divergence was built on a foundation laid during this long, quiet pulling apart, a phase where unity eroded not through catastrophe but through persistence, a planet stretching itself thinner, connections narrowing but not yet broken, a world still recognizable as whole even as it steadily, patiently pulls itself apart. When new oceans formed, they did more than reshape the surface of the Earth. They introduced new clocks, not clocks that ticked on walls or glowed on screens, but clocks that governed rhythm, repetition, and expectation. Time itself began to feel different, not because it moved faster or slower, but because it was now measured by cycles that had never existed before. Before the oceans widened, the planet's dominant rhythms were terrestrial. Seasons rose and fell with the heating and cooling of the land. Rain followed large atmospheric shifts driven by continental interiors. Life timed itself to droughts, floods, fires, and migrations that unfolded over long, predictable arcs. When oceans began to speak more loudly, they layered new rhythms onto the old ones, and those rhythms did not align neatly. A new ocean is not simply a body of water filling a gap. It is an engine. Once seawater floods a rift and connects to the global ocean, it brings with it tides, currents, thermal inertia, and chemical cycles that operate on their own schedules. These processes repeat constantly, daily, monthly, seasonally, over centuries, over millennia. They impose regularity where there was once broad variation. The first new oceans were narrow, elongated seas. They did not immediately resemble the vast basins we know today. Their coastlines were steep and unstable. Their depths increased gradually as the crust beneath them cooled, thickened, and subsided. But even at this early stage, they began to change how time was experienced by the planet. Tides were among the most immediate additions. Where water once stood relatively still in inland seas, now it rose and fell with predictable regularity. The pull of the moon and the sun introduced a daily rhythm that touched every shoreline. Life along these coasts encountered a new kind of repetition. Feeding times aligned with tidal cycles. Reproduction adapted to predictable flooding and exposure. The day itself gained texture. Currents followed. Warm and cold water moved along the length of the new oceans, transporting heat from one region to another. This created temperature gradients that shifted with the seasons. Coastal climates became more moderate, extremes softened, but moderation came at the cost of uniformity. Weather patterns became more variable, more localized. Rain no longer depended solely on land-driven convection. Moisture evaporated from warm seas and travelled inland. Clouds formed more frequently. Storms gained new sources of energy. Rainfall patterns changed not just in amount, but in timing. Instead of long, dry spells punctuated by intense rain, some regions experienced frequent, lighter precipitation. This shift introduced new biological clocks. Plants that once timed growth to rare rain events adapted to more regular moisture. Animals adjusted breeding cycles to seasonal coastal productivity rather than inland scarcity. Life began to synchronize with ocean-driven rhythms layered atop terrestrial ones. The oceans also introduced thermal memory. Water absorbs heat slowly and releases it slowly. This dampened temperature swings near coasts, seasons blurred at the edges, summers cooled, winters warmed. Inland regions remained extreme, but the gradients between interior and coast sharpened. These gradients mattered. They created zones of contrast where ecosystems could diversify. Forests, grasslands, wetlands, and deserts rearranged themselves. Boundaries that once shifted slowly now oscillated more frequently. Species adapted to variability rather than consistency. Sediment cycles changed as well. Rivers that once deposited their loads inland now delivered them to the sea. Deltas formed, coastlines advanced and retreated. Nutrients entered marine systems, fueling productivity. This productivity followed its own clocks, driven by seasonal mixing, sunlight and nutrient availability. Marine life responded quickly. Algae bloomed in cycles. Fish followed those blooms. Predators followed fish. Entire food webs synchronized with oceanic timing. These systems pulsed with regularity, creating predictability on shorter timescales than terrestrial systems had offered. This predictability influenced evolution. Traits that aligned with regular cycles were favoured. Timing became as important as structure. Knowing when to act mattered as much as knowing how. The formation of new oceans also altered the planet's rotation very slightly. Redistribution of mass affects angular momentum. These changes were minuscule, but over geological time they influenced Earth's behaviour. Even the length of a day shifted subtly as continents moved and oceans widened. More importantly, oceans redefined how geological time was recorded. Marine sediments accumulate in layered, continuous sequences. Each layer captures a moment, a condition, a climate state. These layers became the planet's memory, preserving information with a regularity that terrestrial environments rarely achieve. Inland, erosion often removes as much as it deposits. Records are fragmented. At sea, deposition dominates. Time stacks neatly. This created a new archive of Earth's history, one that scientists would later read to understand climate change, extinction events, and continental motion. The presence of oceans also introduced new feedback loops. Ice formation at high latitudes interacted with ocean currents. Glacial cycles emerged more strongly as oceans transported heat toward the poles. Sea levels rose and fell with ice volume, periodically exposing and submerging land bridges. These sea level changes added yet another clock. Coastlines advanced and retreated on cycles tied to climate. Life adapted again, learning to exploit temporary connections and retreat from flooding. Migration routes opened and closed repeatedly. For land-based organisms, this created uncertainty. What had once been a stable route might disappear. What had once been inaccessible might briefly emerge. Selection favoured adaptability, dispersal ability, and behavioural flexibility. Human time, if we imagine it later emerging in such a world, would be shaped profoundly by these rhythms. Fishing would depend on tides. Travel would depend on seasons. Settlements would rise and fall with coastlines. Calendars would reflect lunar cycles as much as solar ones. Even without humans, the planet itself began to operate on overlapping schedules. Daily tides, seasonal currents, multi-year climate oscillations, long-term tectonic drift. These clocks did not replace the old terrestrial ones. They layered onto them, sometimes reinforcing, sometimes interfering. The result was complexity. A world where time was no longer dominated by a single rhythm, but by many interacting ones. Predictability existed, but it was fragmented. Stability existed, but it was dynamic. As oceans widened further, these effects intensified. New basins altered global circulation. Heat distribution changed. Ice caps grew and shrank in new patterns. Atmospheric composition shifted as oceans absorbed carbon dioxide. The Earth became better at regulating itself, but also more sensitive to disruption. Small changes in circulation could have large effects. Feedback loops amplified certain trends. Climate became both buffered and volatile depending on context. Life responded by diversifying. Isolation increased. Evolution accelerated in some regions. Endemism rose. The plural world truly began to emerge. But this plural world was built on the clocks introduced by oceans. Without them, separation would have been simpler. With them, separation became structured. Time itself became regional. It's enough to recognize that when new oceans formed, the Earth did not just gain water, it gained schedules, it gained memory, it gained repetition. The planet began to live by many clocks at once, and from that moment on, no part of the surface would ever experience time in quite the same way again. Imagining a world where Pangaea never broke apart is not the same as imagining a world frozen in time. The Earth does not stop changing simply because its surface remains connected. Mountains would still rise and fall, climate would still shift, life would still evolve, adapt, and disappear. What changes is not motion itself, but the boundaries within which motion occurs. In a world where Pangaea never broke, change would have unfolded on a shared stage rather than across separated ones. If the supercontinent had remained intact, the most immediate difference would not be visual, but structural. The planet would still operate as a single mechanical system at the surface. Stress from mantle convection would be distributed across one continuous landmass rather than being relieved through the creation of multiple ocean basins. This alone would alter the long-term behaviour of the crust. Without major oceanic spreading centres opening between continents, the balance between creation and destruction of crust would shift. Subduction zones might still exist along the margins of the supercontinent, where oceanic crust descended beneath continental edges. But the absence of large internal oceans would limit how and where these processes occurred. Mountain building would continue, but it would be concentrated along fewer boundaries. Over time, this could lead to an Earth with fewer but more massive mountain systems. Instead of multiple young mountain ranges forming on different continents at different times, compression would focus repeatedly along similar regions. Old mountains might be rejuvenated again and again rather than eroded away and replaced elsewhere. The planet's topography would feel more entrenched, less redistributed. Climate in such a world would be profoundly different. A single massive landmass would continue to produce extreme continental interiors. Even with changing atmospheric composition and solar output, the basic pattern would persist. Harsh seasonal contrasts would dominate much of the land. Coastal moderation would be limited to the outer margins of the supercontinent. This would not mean uniform dryness or cold. Climate systems would still evolve. Greenhouse periods would bring warmer global temperatures. Ice ages would still occur under the right conditions, but the spatial expression of those changes would be constrained by continuity. When the planet warmed, large interior regions would become hotter together. When it cooled, cold would spread broadly rather than being compartmentalized. Rainfall patterns would remain dominated by land-driven processes. Monsoon-like systems would still arise due to differential heating, but their scale would be continental rather than regional. Deserts would likely persist in vast interior zones, shifting their boundaries slowly over time but never fully disappearing. Forests, when conditions allowed, could still span enormous distances. Grasslands and shrublands would form transitional belts between wetter and drier regions. Ecosystems would continue to exist as gradients rather than isolated patches. The biological consequences of this continuity would be far-reaching. Evolution would still produce diversity, but the mechanisms driving it would favour breadth over fragmentation. Isolation would occur through climate, elevation and distance rather than oceans. This would slow the rate at which population diverged into completely separate species. Endemism would exist, but it would be rarer and more localized. Unique species would likely arise in extreme environments such as high mountain plateaus, deep interior basins, or unusual soil types. However, the dramatic biological uniqueness we see today on islands and isolated continents would be much less common. Large animals might persist longer in such a world. One of the pressures that drives extinction is habitat fragmentation. In a continuous landmass, species facing environmental stress could migrate rather than vanish. This does not guarantee survival, but it increases resilience. Extinction events would still occur, especially during global climate shifts or asteroid impacts, but recovery might draw from a broader genetic pool. Predator-prey dynamics would also differ. Without isolated ecosystems, invasive species as we understand them today would not exist in the same way. New adaptations would spread gradually rather than appearing suddenly in vulnerable regions. Competition would be more evenly distributed. Disease dynamics would follow similar patterns. Pathogens would spread more slowly across land rather than jumping oceans via chance events. Populations would co-evolve with diseases over longer periods, potentially leading to more stable host-pathogen relationships. If humans or human-like beings eventually emerged in such a world, their history would unfold very differently. Geography shapes culture as much as biology. A connected world would encourage diffusion over isolation. Technologies, languages and practices would spread gradually across land rather than developing independently on separate continents. This does not mean global uniformity. Distance still matters. Communication would still be limited by travel speed. Cultural differences would emerge and persist. But the sharp contrast driven by long-term isolation would be softened. The idea of entirely separate worlds would be less intuitive. Exploration would mean endurance rather than navigation. There would be no crossing of oceans to reach unknown lands. Instead, exploration would involve long journeys through changing climates and terrains. Myths would focus on distant regions rather than unreachable ones. Political boundaries, if they arose, would be defined by geography such as mountains and rivers rather than seas. Conflict and cooperation would follow land routes. Trade networks would be vast but continuous, adapting to terrain rather than water crossings. Technological development might follow different priorities. Seafaring cultures would be limited to coastal margins. Inland civilizations would dominate large portions of the landmass. Maritime trade would exist, but it would not be the primary driver of global connection. Climate feedbacks would also differ. Without multiple oceans distributing heat independently, the planet's climate system would be simpler but more extreme. The buffering effect of large oceans would be limited to the periphery. This could make global climate shifts more severe when they occurred. Ice ages might produce more extensive continental ice sheets if conditions allowed, given the large land areas at higher latitudes. Alternatively, greenhouse periods could produce more intense heat build-up inland, stressing ecosystems adapted to narrower ranges. The carbon cycle would operate differently as well. Extensive forests could store large amounts of carbon, but their vulnerability to drought and fire would be high. Without widespread coastal wetlands and shallow seas, some carbon sinks would be reduced. Atmospheric composition could fluctuate more dramatically. Over geological time, even a stable supercontinent would not remain perfectly intact. Small rifts might form and heal. Inland seas might appear and vanish. The Earth resists permanence. But without sustained breakup, these features would be temporary, absorbed back into the whole. This would reinforce a worldview, if one could be imagined, of Earth as a single entity rather than a collection of parts. Change would be understood as internal variation rather than separation. It's also worth considering what might be lost in such a world. Fragmentation drives innovation. Isolation allows experiments to run independently. Many of the unique species and ecosystems we treasure today exist because land was divided. A unified world might be more resilient, but less inventive in certain ways. The explosion of biodiversity in isolated regions might never occur. Some evolutionary paths would never be explored. Life would be broader, but perhaps less intricate in its extremes. Still, the sense of continuity would shape everything. The planet would feel coherent. Events in one region would resonate across the whole more directly. There would be fewer buffers between cause and effect. If Pangaea had never broken, Earth's history would not be quieter or simpler. It would be different in emphasis. Change would be slower to diverge but broader in impact. Life would evolve in conversation with itself rather than in separate rooms. And perhaps most importantly, time would feel shared. The clocks introduced by oceans would remain limited. Seasonal and climatic rhythms would dominate over tidal ones. The planet would move to fewer beats, but those beats would be strong. For now, it's enough to let this alternate Earth exist in the background. A world that stayed together, a planet that chose cohesion over separation. Not static, not peaceful, but unified in a way we can no longer experience firsthand, only imagine through stone, climate, and the slow memory of the ground. If humanity had emerged on a world that never truly divided itself, the idea of a single shore would not have meant a coastline shared by all people, but a shared orientation toward the land itself. The defining feature of such a world would not be oceans separating populations, but distances stretching across continuous terrain. Human history, culture, movement and identity would be shaped first and foremost by land, not water. On a unified Earth, early human ancestors would have evolved in an environment where migration was always an option. Climate shifts would not trap populations behind seas or force sudden adaptation in isolation. When conditions became unfavourable, groups could move, slowly and generationally, following animals, vegetation and water sources across vast regions. This would encourage a deep evolutionary reliance on mobility, endurance, and spatial awareness. Bipedalism, already linked to long-distance travel in our own history, might become even more central. Human bodies could evolve to optimize sustained movement over open terrain. Endurance would be favored over short bursts of speed. Energy efficiency would matter more than specialization. The human form might not look radically different, but small differences in muscle distribution, thermoregulation, and metabolism could emerge over time. Cognitively, a connected world would shape how humans perceive space and possibility. There would be no natural concept of an unreachable landmass. The unknown would exist, but it would always be theoretically accessible by walking. This changes how curiosity expresses itself. Exploration would be a matter of commitment rather than risk-taking. There would be fewer moments of sudden discovery and more of gradual expansion. Language would reflect this. Words for distance, direction and terrain would likely be more nuanced than words for crossing or separation. Metaphors would be grounded in travel over land rather than journeys over water. Stories would focus on long roads, changing climates, and encounters with distant but related peoples, rather than voyages into the unknown. Cultural divergence would still occur, but it would be shaped by gradients rather than barriers. Differences in language, belief and practice would accumulate with distance and time, but contact would never be fully severed. Trade routes could stretch across continents, evolving slowly as terrain and climate demanded. Knowledge would diffuse unevenly but persistently. Technological development would follow these patterns. Tools and techniques would spread gradually, rather than appearing independently in isolated regions. Innovation might be slower in some respects, but more cumulative in others. Instead of multiple independent inventions of similar technologies, improvements would build upon one another across space. This could lead to earlier standardization in certain areas. Measurement systems, basic agricultural practices, and tool designs might converge more readily. Not because cultures were identical, but because ideas would have fewer hard stops. At the same time, local adaptations would still flourish, shaped by environment and resources. Agriculture itself would unfold differently. Domesticated plants and animals could spread across large areas without needing to cross oceans. This would accelerate the expansion of farming, but also increase competition between agricultural and hunter-gatherer lifestyles. Cultural transitions might be more gradual, with mixed economies persisting longer. Disease dynamics would be profoundly affected. In a connected world, pathogens would spread slowly but steadily. Populations would be exposed to a broader range of diseases over longer periods, potentially leading to stronger baseline immunity, but also reducing the dramatic impacts of first contact events that defined much of our actual history. Epidemics would still occur, especially in dense populations, but their spread would be more continuous rather than explosive across isolated regions. This could reduce the severity of population collapses associated with sudden disease introduction, altering the course of civilizations. Political organisation would also reflect geography. Large land empires might be more common, not because conquest was easier, but because continuity allowed influence to extend gradually. Borders would be defined by terrain and logistics rather than seas. Control would fade with distance rather than stopping abruptly. This would encourage decentralized governance. Maintaining authority across vast continuous land would require flexible systems rather than rigid centralization. Cultural cohesion would rely more on shared practices and less on enforced boundaries. Conflict, when it occurred, would follow land routes. Armies would move over terrain rather than across water. Naval power would exist only along the margins of the supercontinent, limiting its global importance. Control of key land corridors, mountain passes and fertile basins would matter more than control of seas. Trade would be terrestrial at its core. Goods would move by caravan, river and road. This would slow exchange compared to maritime trade but make it more predictable. Trade networks would be resilient, adapting to disruptions by rerouting rather than collapsing. Urbanization patterns would differ as well. Coastal megacities might be fewer or less dominant. Inland cities near rivers, crossroads, and fertile regions would anchor civilizations. Cultural centres would emerge where routes intersected rather than where ships docked. The concept of a shore would still exist, but it would be peripheral rather than central. The ocean would be something encountered at the edges of the world, not a medium of connection between its centres. Myths about the sea might focus on danger and finality rather than opportunity. Philosophically, a unified land might encourage a stronger sense of shared humanity. Differences would exist, but the awareness that all people occupy the same continuous surface could influence ethical frameworks. The idea of absolute otherness might be weaker. Conflict would still arise, but dehumanization might face different constraints. Time perception would also differ. Without the strong tidal and maritime rhythm shaping daily life for most people, human schedules would be more tightly tied to seasons, daylight, and land-based cycles. Calendars would emphasize agricultural and climatic markers over lunar tides. Navigation skills would prioritize reading land, stars, and weather over mastering open water travel. Memory of routes, landmarks, and seasonal changes would be culturally significant. Oral traditions might encode vast geographical knowledge. Writing systems, when they emerged, might spread more uniformly. Scripts could evolve through gradual modification across regions rather than branching dramatically. Linguistic families might be broader and less fragmented. Religious and spiritual systems would likely reflect land-based cosmologies. Sacred mountains, rivers and plains would dominate mythic landscapes. Oceans, being distant for most, might represent boundaries of existence rather than central forces. All of this suggests a humanity that is more continuous, less punctuated by sharp historical breaks. Major turning points would still exist, driven by climate shifts, technological leaps, or internal conflict, but they would propagate differently. The absence of long-term continental isolation would limit the emergence of radically different trajectories. Human societies would feel variations of a shared story rather than separate narratives that collide unexpectedly. At the same time, this continuity could limit certain forms of creativity born from isolation. Some cultural and technological leaps arise precisely because groups are cut off and forced to solve problems independently. A unified world might be more stable but less surprising. Still, the idea of humanity on a single shore highlights how deeply geography shapes who we become. Our actual history is a product of oceans as much as land. Remove those oceans and everything shifts. The memory of one Earth does not live in a single place. It isn't stored neatly in a mountain range, or buried in one perfect fossil bed, or preserved in a single layer of stone. It lives instead in fragments, scattered across continents that no longer touch, carried quietly in patterns that only make sense when they are put back together. The planet does not remember in words, but it does remember in structure, in chemistry, in motion. And those memories tell the story of a time when separation was not the rule, but the exception. Even now, long after the continents have drifted apart, the Earth still behaves like something that once knew itself as whole. The way plates move, the way stress travels through the crust, the way climate systems interact across oceans, all of it carries echoes of that earlier state. Fragmentation changed the surface, but it did not erase the habits formed over billions of years. You can see this memory in rocks that should not resemble each other, but do. Mountain belts in different continents line up when traced backward. Mineral compositions match across oceans. Ancient river deposits appear on lands now separated by thousands of kilometres of water. These are not coincidences. They are reminders that what is distant now was once adjacent, shaped by the same forces at the same time. The memory of one Earth is also written into life itself. Genetic lineages split by oceans still carry shared ancestry that only makes sense in a connected world. Plants with related structures appear in places that would be impossible to reach without continuity. Animals that evolved long before the oceans widened still show patterns of distribution that reflect ancient pathways rather than modern geography. Even extinction events remember unity. Mass extinctions that occurred during or shortly after fragmentation left different signatures on different continents, but they were driven by global processes: volcanism, climate shifts, atmospheric change. The responses were regional, but the cause was planetary. The Earth still experiences crisis as a whole, even when it expresses recovery in parts. Climate too remembers. The way heat is distributed, the way oceans circulate, the way ice forms and retreats, all of it follows constraints inherited from earlier configurations. The placement of continents today affects climate, but it does so on a planet whose internal engine was tuned during eras of unity. The feedback loops did not start over. They adapted. The carbon cycle is one of the clearest examples. Forests, oceans, rocks and atmosphere exchange carbon constantly. This system evolved during times when land and sea interacted differently. The balances we see now are modifications of older ones. The Earth does not invent new systems lightly. It adjusts existing ones. Even time itself carries memory. Geological time is not just a measure of duration. It is a record of rhythm. Periods of supercontinent assembly and breakup repeat across Earth's history. Unity, fragmentation, drift, collision. These cycles suggest that the planet is not wandering randomly. It is oscillating within a set of possibilities shaped by its size, composition, and energy. The memory of one Earth is also present in how separation never feels complete. Continents drift apart, but they remain connected through ocean currents, atmospheric circulation, and tectonic forces. Dust from one continent fertilizes forests on another. Heat released in one region affects climate elsewhere. Earthquakes ripple across plates. The planet never truly becomes many. It becomes many surfaces on one body. This lingering connection is why the idea of an original world order resonates so strongly. It is not just nostalgia for a simpler map. It is recognition of an underlying coherence that persists despite division. The Earth may be fragmented at the surface, but it still functions as a single system underneath. For humans, this memory manifests in subtler ways. We're drawn to maps. We instinctively try to reconnect pieces, to imagine how things once fit together. We trace lines across oceans, reconstructing ancient worlds, not only because it satisfies curiosity, but because it feels like recovering something familiar. The story of Pangaea is not compelling simply because it is dramatic. It is compelling because it suggests that separation is not the natural baseline. It is a phase, a condition, one that can change. This does not mean the Earth will reunite its continents anytime soon. Supercontinent cycles operate over hundreds of millions of years, but it does mean that the current configuration is not final. The planet has no final form. It rearranges itself endlessly, carrying memory forward even as it changes shape. That memory influences how the future will unfold. The locations of future rifts are shaped by past ones. The paths of future mountains follow ancient weaknesses. The continents we know today will not drift randomly. They will move along inherited lines, guided by scars and strengths formed long ago. Life, too, carries forward the consequences of unity and division. Biodiversity today reflects both the resilience of a connected world and the creativity of a fragmented one. Some lineages owe their survival to the ability to move across land before separation. Others owe their uniqueness to isolation afterward. Both stories coexist. Humanity stands at a peculiar moment in this long narrative. We are a species shaped by fragmentation, by oceans and borders and separation, yet capable of understanding unity at a planetary scale. We can see the Earth as a whole again, not physically, but conceptually. Satellites show us a single sphere. Climate models remind us that actions in one place affect all others. In this sense, the memory of one Earth is becoming conscious, not because the planet is awakening, but because one of its creations has learned how to perceive systems beyond immediate surroundings. We can recognize that the air we breathe, the water we drink, and the stability we depend on are products of global interaction, not local isolation. This awareness carries responsibility. A fragmented world can give the illusion that consequences stop at borders. A remembered world reveals that they do not. The Earth does not forget disturbances. It absorbs them, redistributes them, and responds over time. The ancient story of Pangaea reminds us that stability and change are not opposites. They are partners. Unity provided resilience. Fragmentation provided diversity. The planet needs both. Too much rigidity limits adaptation. Too much division weakens coherence. The memory of one Earth is therefore not an argument for returning to a past state. It is a lens for understanding balance. A reminder that systems work best when connections exist alongside differences. As you sit with this idea, wherever you are listening from, it's worth noticing how much of your own life depends on hidden connections. Food grown elsewhere, energy generated far away, weather influenced by distant oceans. None of this is accidental. It is the modern expression of an ancient truth. The Earth was once one, not because it was simpler, but because it had not yet learned how to divide itself. When it did so slowly, carefully, and incompletely. The memory of that wholeness never vanished. It was carried forward, reshaped, and embedded into everything that followed. And now, here we are, living on the surface of a planet that remembers itself as one even as it continues to drift, to separate, to rearrange. The ground beneath you is not finished moving. The systems around you are not finished evolving. The story does not end here, because the Earth does not end chapters cleanly. It transitions, it carries memory forward, it changes without forgetting. So as this exploration settles, not into an ending but into a pause, it's enough to hold on to that sense of continuity. A planet that has been many things but has never stopped being itself. A world that once held all its land together and still, in quieter ways, remembers what that felt like.